October in North Texas usually brings a relief from the summer heat, but in 1996 the dust still hung heavy over the fields of Wise County. Near the town of Decatur, about 40 miles northwest of the Dallas-Fort Worth sprawl, life moves at a pace dictated by the land. It is a place of wide open spaces and quiet ranches where you expect to hear nothing but the lowing of cattle or the whistle of the wind through the cedar trees. But on October 8, 1996, that peace was shattered by a discovery that would haunt the local community for decades. A local rancher was out on his property, doing the kind of back-breaking labor that defines life in rural Texas. He was working near a pile of dead branches and cedar brush, debris that had been gathered and left to rot at the edge of his land. As he began to clear the pile, something caught his eye that didn't belong in the dirt. It wasn't a fallen limb or a stray animal. It was a flash of pale human skin. In an instant, the routine of a Tuesday morning turned into a nightmare. Hidden within that heap of dead wood was the nude body of a young female. She had been discarded like a piece of trash, left to be reclaimed by the earth in a place where the killer clearly thought she would never be found. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, the scene told a violent story. It appeared the girl had been strangled and then dragged by her arm into the brush pile, her body left in a position that suggested a total lack of mercy. The elements had not been kind. Because of the humidity and the Texas sun, her body was no longer in a recognizable state. This presented an immediate and massive hurdle for the men wearing badges. There were no pockets to search for an ID, no jewelry to trace, and no scars, tattoos to help give this girl back her name. All they had were a few small, heartbreaking details. She had blonde hair that had been dyed, and despite the trauma she had endured, one thing stood out to the investigators. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick. It was the mark of a child who had lived with a lot of nerves, a girl who had likely been anxious long before she met her end in that field. At the time, the police estimated her age was anywhere between 20 and 40 years old, a mistake that would prove to be a tragic turning point in the search for her identity. Because they were looking for a grown woman, they didn't realize that the person lying in that brush pile was actually a 14-year-old child whose family was only a few hours away. For the next 730 days, this girl belonged to no one. She was a ghost in the system. The local investigator, Phil Ryan, eventually began calling her Brush Girl because Jane Doe felt too cold, too clinical for a child who had been left in the dirt. For 2 long years, the people of Decatur wondered who she was and who could have been so heartless as to leave her there. She was a mystery wrapped in a tragedy. A daughter someone had to be missing. Yet the silence from the public was deafening. This case is a reminder that some victims are made invisible by the very world they live in. They slip through the cracks of our cities and end up as headlines in small-town newspapers, far from the people who once knew their names. Before we go any further into the life that April Lacy lived before she became the Brush Girl, I want to take a second to bring our community together. Where are you watching from today? We have viewers from the tiny towns of Texas to the biggest cities in the world. Drop your location in the comments so we can see how far April's story is reaching. If you believe that every victim deserves the dignity of a name and the promise of justice, please hit that subscribe button. Here at Cold Cases Files, we don't just tell stories, we honor the people behind them. Your support helps us keep the light shining on cases that the world tried to forget. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an update as we piece together the truth. As we look back at 1996, we have to ask, how does a 14-year-old girl vanish from her life and stay nameless in a morgue for 2 years? The answer lies in the dark corners of the I-35 corridor and a home life that was more dangerous than the streets themselves. To understand the story of the girl found in the brush, we have to travel back across the state line to Oklahoma City in the mid-90s. This wasn't the Oklahoma of shiny skyscrapers or suburban dreams. This was the Oklahoma of the margins, a world of cheap motels, transient neighborhoods, and families fighting a losing battle against the weight of poverty. April Dawn Lacy was born into this world on June 2nd, 1982. By the time she was 14 years old, her life was already a series of unstable chapters. Her parents, Jacqueline and Dale Lacy, were caught in the grip of a darkness that many families in the 90s knew too well. They were lost to a cycle of alcohol and cocaine addiction. a struggle that often left April to fend for herself. The family didn't have a permanent address. They lived in motels, places where the carpet was stained and the walls were thin enough to hear the heartbreak of the neighbors. Money was a constant, gnawing worry. To survive, the family relied on the informal economy of the streets. April and her parents would spend their days scavenging through trash bins and refuse piles, looking for aluminum cans or anything else they could sell at a recycling center for a few dollars. Imagine a 14-year-old girl who should have been worrying about school dances or homework, digging through garbage just to make sure there was enough money for the next meal, or more often for her parents' next fix. This was a world where children grow up far too fast. Because of the volatility at home, April was often estranged from her parents. She would spend days, sometimes weeks, staying with friends just to escape the noise and the tension of the motel room. She was desperate for a stability she couldn't find within her own four walls. Before we look closer at the dark reality of April's home life, I want to take a quick pause. Where are you watching from today? Whether you're in a big city like Oklahoma City or a quiet town like Decatur, your presence here helps keep April's memory alive. Let us know in the comments. Beyond the poverty, there was a much more sinister layer to April's existence. Detectives who looked into the case later stated that they found strong evidence of systemic exploitation within the Lacy household. Law enforcement officials believe that April's mother, Jacqueline, had coerced the young girl into shoplifting and, most tragically, into the world of street-level prostitution. The police theory was that April was being used as a source of income to fund her mother's cocaine addiction. Jacqueline Lacy would go on to deny these claims for the rest of her life, insisting her daughter was never involved in sex trafficking. But the people who wore the badges in Oklahoma City saw a different story. They saw a child who was being sold by the very person who was supposed to be her sanctuary. April herself had reportedly told others about the physical abuse she suffered whenever she failed to bring home enough money. This environment created a girl who was constantly on edge. When her body was found in Texas, the most telling physical detail was her bitten fingernails, raw and jagged. It's a small detail, but it speaks volumes about the level of anxiety she carried every single day. She was a child living in a state of perpetual high alert, walking a tightrope between the dangers of the street and the toxicity of her home. If you find it important to highlight the stories of youth who are being failed by the system, please take a moment to subscribe to Cold Cases Files. We are dedicated to telling the truth about these cases, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. Hit the like button to help April's story reach a wider audience. Every click is a step toward making sure these children are never forgotten again. The final breaking point came on October 3rd, 1996. April and her mother were in the middle of a massive argument in their motel room. We don't know exactly what was said that night, but the fallout was deep. Jacqueline reportedly stopped talking to her daughter, refusing to even look at her. For a girl who already felt invisible to the rest of the world, this silence from her mother was the last straw. April stormed out of that room and into the night. She likely thought she was just getting some air, or maybe she was planning to head to a friend's house like she had done so many times before. She didn't have a suitcase. She didn't have a plan. She just had a 14-year-old's anger and a desperate need to be anywhere else. She walked away from the motel and into the territory of predators. The I-35 corridor was only a short distance away, a massive interstate highway that acted as a hunting ground for men who looked for girls exactly like April. Girls who were alone, girls who looked like runaways, girls who nobody would immediately come looking for. Jacqueline did report April missing that same day, October 3rd. From the authorities was colored by the family's reputation. To the police, April was just another troubled kid who would probably show up in a few days. The urgency that usually accompanies a missing child was missing here. Even more confusing is the role of her father, Dale Lacy. While Jacqueline made the report on the day April vanished, Dale didn't bother to file a missing person report for another 3 months. Think about that for a second. 90 days passed before the father went to the police. In that window of time, any trail that April might have left behind in Oklahoma City had gone cold. The witnesses at the gas stations were gone. The surveillance tapes, if there were any in the mid-90s, had been taped over. Because of this reporting gap, April's case was filed away under the runaway category. While she was being logged as a missing kid in Oklahoma, her body was being logged as an unidentified Jane Doe in Texas. The system had effectively split her in two. I'm curious about the world you're in right now. What's the weather like today? Is it a grey, rainy afternoon or a clear night? Tell us in the comments. It's interesting to see how the atmosphere where you are changes the way you experience these deep dives. By the time April's remains were found on October 8, only 5 days after she walked out of that motel, she was already a world away from home. But the tragedy of the Lacy case isn't just that she was killed. It's that she was lost long before she ever reached that field in Texas. She was a girl who slipped through the cracks of a broken home, a broken city, and a broken system. When we return, we're going into the forensic hunt for the brush girl and the early mistakes that ensured she would remain a mystery for 2 long years. For 2 long years, the girl found in that pile of cedar branches was a ghost haunting the evidence lockers of Wise County. In a small town like Decatur, news of a body found on local land usually travels like a wildfire, but when that body has no name, the fire eventually turns to ash. The people of the town were gripped by a quiet, lingering anxiety. They knew someone's daughter was lying in a cold drawer at the morgue, but the world outside Wise County seemed to have no idea she existed. Officer Phil Ryan, a lead investigator who eventually became the Wise County Sheriff, was a man who felt the weight of this silence every single day. He looked at the few pieces of evidence they had gathered from that desolate field. There was no ID, no purse, no shoes, just a young girl who had been manually strangled and discarded. Ryan was the one who gave her the name Brush Girl. He didn't want her to be just another case number, a Jane Doe lost in a dusty filing cabinet. He wanted to give the community something to call her, a way to remember that she was a human being who deserved a name. The biggest obstacle in the early days was a massive forensic error that set the clock back by years. When the initial medical examiners looked at the remains, they estimated the victim was a woman between 20 and 40 years old. This single mistake acted as a brick wall. While detectives in Texas were scanning databases for missing adult women, the real victim, a 14-year-old child, was being searched for by police in Oklahoma. The two efforts were running on parallel tracks, but they never intersected because they weren't looking for the same person. Think about the technical reality of the mid-90s. There was no instant data sharing. There was no internet database where a sheriff in Texas could easily see a missing person photo from 3 counties away, let alone another state. Information moved in folders and through phone calls. If the description didn't match, the folder was closed. Because of that 20 to 40 age estimate, every time a report for a missing 14-year-old came across a desk, it was tossed aside as not a match. Despite the decomposition, certain physical traits remained as silent witnesses to the girl's life. She had dyed her hair blonde, a decomposition, common choice for a teenager trying to find her own look. And then there were those fingernails, bitten down so far they must have been painful. This wasn't just a habit, it was a character trait. It told Phil Ryan that this girl was anxious. She was someone who carried the stress of her world on her fingertips. This was a girl who had likely been running from something or living in a state of fear long before she met her killer. The search was plagued by a haunting discrepancy in the timeline. April's mother said the argument happened on October 3rd, and the body was found on October 8th. That is a 5-day window. Still, the medical examiner's report was blunt. The state of her body suggested she had been dead for at least a full week, perhaps longer. This creates a disturbing question that has never been fully answered. If she was dead for a week before October 8, she would have been killed on or before October 1st. If her mother reported the fight on October 3rd, was she lying about the date? Or had April been gone much longer than her mother was willing to admit? Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. What time is it right now where you are? Some of you are watching this in the middle of the night, while others are just starting your day. Let us know in the comments. It's a small way to remember that while time stands still for victims like April, the world keeps turning for the rest of us. If this investigation into the failures of the past is hitting home for you, please hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that stories like April shouldn't stay buried in the brush. We are dedicated to bringing these forgotten cases back into the light And your support is what makes that possible. Phil Ryan and his team didn't give up. They worked every lead, no matter how small. They reached out to the FBI. They looked at missing person reports from Dallas and as far away as Oklahoma City, but as long as they were told the victim was an adult, those 14-year-old runaways were ruled out. A year into the work, a similar case popped up in New Mexico, a torso murder that shared some eerie similarities, but that too led to a dead end. The town of Decatur became her surrogate family. People left flowers at the site where she was found. They talked about her in the local diners. But as the months turned into a year, and then too the brush girl began to feel like a permanent mystery. She was buried in a pauper's grave, a simple service for a girl nobody claimed. The silence was finally broken not by a witness, but by a forensic dentist who took a second look at the teeth. This was the moment everything changed. The dentist looked at the development of the molars and the jawbone and delivered a shock to the system. This wasn't a 20-year-old woman. This was a child. She was approximately 14 years old. With this new information, the search was reborn. The hunt for a missing woman was tossed out, and the search for a missing girl began. But by 1998, the trail was 2 years old. The gas stations along I-35 had seen thousands of faces since that October night. The motels had been cleaned and re-rented hundreds of times. The killer had 2 years of a head start, and the system had given it to him for free. I'm curious about the world around you right now. What's the weather like today? Is it a grey, heavy afternoon, or is the sun out? Drop it in the comments. Sometimes the atmosphere where you are makes these stories feel even more real. The brush girl remained a mystery because the world she came from was just as invisible as the field where she was found. She was a child of the highway, a girl who moved in the shadows of the 90s street culture. It would take a pioneer in forensic art to pull her out of those shadows and give her back to the family who had spent 2 years in a state of denial. When we return, we are going to look at the incredible work of Karen Taylor, the woman who took a skull and turned it back into a daughter. We'll see how a single sketch finally broke the silence and forced a family to face a reality they had been running from for 730 days. By the time 1998 rolled around, the case of the brush girl had become a heavy weight for the investigators in Wise County. For 2 years, a small skull had sat on a shelf, a silent witness to a crime that the world seemed ready to forget. The trail along the I-35 corridor was cold. The local leads had dried up. But in the world of forensics, there is a saying that the bones never stop talking. You just have to find someone who knows how to listen. Enter Karen Taylor. Based in Fort Worth, Taylor was a pioneer in a field that sits right at the intersection of high science and fine art. She wasn't just a sketch artist, she was a facial reconstructionist who spent her days staring into the empty eye sockets of the nameless, trying to find the spark of life that used to be there. In the mid-90s, her work was transformative. While others were using thick clay to build three-dimensional busts, Taylor had pioneered a two-dimensional method that was bringing people home at an incredible rate. The process of giving a face back to the brush girl didn't start with a drawing. It started with the skull itself. Taylor began by adhering small, cylindrical tissue-depth markers to specific anthropological points on the bone. These markers are based on decades of data, measurements that tell an artist exactly how much muscle and skin sits over a cheekbone or a brow for a girl of a certain age and race. Because the forensic dentist had corrected the earlier age error, Taylor knew she was working on a 14-year-old child. This changed everything. The thickness of the skin on a teenager's face is different from that of a 40-year-old woman. There is a soft, youthful roundness to the jaw that hasn't yet been sharpened by the stresses of adulthood. Taylor then took frontal and lateral photographs of the skull with the markers in place. Over these photos, she began the painstaking work of layering life back onto the bone. She used the bridge of the nose to calculate the projection of the nostrils. She used the width of the teeth to estimate the corners of the mouth. Every stroke of her pencil was guided by the architecture of the skull beneath it. But Taylor didn't just want a generic face. She wanted a likeness. She thought about the bitten fingernails that the investigators had mentioned. She thought about the dyed blonde hair. She drew a girl who looked like she had seen a lot of the world, but was still fundamentally a child. It was a face that carried a quiet, unsettling vulnerability. Before we get to the moment this face hit the national news, I want to check in with you. What time is it there? Are you watching this over a lunch break or late at night in the dark? Let us know in the comments. Your time and attention help give these cases the audience they deserve. While you're at it, if you find this look into the science of justice fascinating, please hit that subscribe button. We are a community of truth seekers at Cold Cases Files, and every new member helps us push for answers in cases that have gone silent. Hit the like button to help April's face reach one more person who might remember her. In April of 1998, exactly 2 years after the brush girl was discarded, the reconstruction was finished. It was a striking image, a teenage girl with large, expressive eyes and a soft jawline. The Wise County Sheriff's Office didn't just keep the sketch in a file. They knew they needed a massive platform. The breakthrough came on April 8, 1998, when the case was featured on a national broadcast of America's Most Wanted. The show, hosted by John Walsh, was a powerhouse for solving cold cases in the 90s. Walsh stood before the camera and showed Taylor's reconstruction to millions of people across the United States. Response was immediate. In Oklahoma City, people who had known the Lacy family were stunned. They looked at the screen and didn't see a Jane Doe or a brush girl. They saw April. They saw the 14-year-old who had stormed out of a motel room and never came back. But as the tips flooded in, a new kind of tragedy began to unfold. When the investigators contacted Jacqueline and Dale Lacy, the reaction wasn't one of relief. It was denial. Even when showed the sketch that looked exactly like their daughter, the family reportedly refused to believe it. They wanted more proof than a drawing. They were stuck in a state of suspended grief, perhaps hoping that April was still out there somewhere, just running away from the life they had provided for her. The scientists had to step in where the family couldn't. Forensic dentists compared the dental records from the brush girl remains to April's childhood x-rays. It was a perfect match. To be absolutely certain, investigators even used a rare technique. They compared the sinus passages from the unidentified remains to April's previous medical records. The sinus cavities in a human being are as unique as a fingerprint. They were identical. Even with this overwhelming scientific evidence, the Lacy family remained skeptical. It wasn't until DNA testing, a burgeoning field in the late 90s, officially confirmed the link that the denial finally broke. The brush girl was officially, undeniably April Dawn Lacy. The restoration of her name was a victory for Phil Ryan and Karen Taylor, but it was a hollow one. Identification is only half of the battle. Now that the police knew who the victim was, they had to figure out who had taken her. They had to look at the stretch of road between Oklahoma City and Decatur. They had to look at the long-haul truckers, the transient workers, and the monsters who lived in the cab of a semi-truck. The investigation was no longer about a ghost. It was about a 14-year-old girl who had been failed by her parents, failed by the reporting system, and finally murdered by a predator who thought she would never be missed. To understand how April Lacy ended up in a brush pile in Decatur, you have to understand the road that brought her there. The I-35 is more than just a highway. It is a river of asphalt that cuts through the very heart of the country, stretching from the Mexican border all the way to Canada. In the 90s, this road was a world unto itself. It was a place of endless motion, of diesel fumes and flickering neon signs, and for a certain kind of man, it was the perfect place to hide. The I-35 corridor provided a level of anonymity that we can barely imagine in our modern world of GPS and constant surveillance. Back then, you could pick up a person in one city, drive for 3 hours across a state line, and leave them in a field where they might not be found for days or weeks. By the time the police even knew a crime had been committed, the killer was often 500 miles away, blending back into the flow of traffic. For a long time, the name John Robert Williams didn't mean anything to the people of Wise County, but in the world of long-haul trucking, he was a ghost who left a trail of tragedy in his wake. Known as the Big Rig Killer, Williams spent his life behind the wheel of a semi-truck, a vehicle that acted as a mobile crime scene. He didn't just kill, he used the mobility of his job to ensure that his victims were scattered across the map, making it nearly impossible for local sheriffs to connect the dots. Williams eventually admitted to a staggering number of crimes. He has claimed responsibility for at least 30 or 32 murders, with his first taking place when he was only 16 years old. His pattern was distinct. He looked for the most vulnerable people, young girls who were alone at truck stops or walking along the service roads. He looked for the girls who looked like they were running from something. In many ways, April Lacy was his ideal target. She was a 14-year-old on her own in the middle of the night, standing on the edge of a world that didn't seem to want her. Detectives have long noted that the way April was found, nude, strangled, and discarded in a rural dumping ground near a major transit route, matches the bone-cold patterns of truckers like Williams. But Williams isn't the only monster associated with this stretch of road. Before we look at the man who was released from prison just 48 hours after April vanished, I want to ask, where are you watching from today? Some of these names might be familiar to those of you living in Oklahoma or North Texas. Let us know in the comments if you remember the news coverage from that era. If you believe that no killer should ever be allowed to fade into the shadows, please hit that subscribe button. Here at Cold Cases Files, we are dedicated to digging through the records and making sure these names are never forgotten. Every like on this video helps us push the truth a little further into the light. The most haunting name in the files of the April Lacy case is William Lewis Reese. The timing of his life and April's death is a coincidence that many investigators find difficult to swallow. Reese was a serial predator who had already served 10 years in an Oklahoma prison for 2 violent rapes committed in 1986. He was released on October 5, 1996. April vanished from that motel on October 3rd. While her body wasn't found until October 8, the medical examiner was firm in the belief that she had been dead for at least a week before she was discovered. This means the person who killed her likely did so right around the time William Reese was walking out of those prison gates. Reese was a man who didn't wait to start hunting again. In 1997, he embarked on a horrific spree that claimed the lives of Laura Smither, Kelly Cox, Tiffany Johnston, and Jessica Kane. He knew the back roads and the quiet fields where he could bury his secrets. In 2016, after DNA evidence finally linked him to the murder of Tiffany Johnston in Oklahoma, he decided to start talking to save his own life. He led the Texas Rangers to the remains of Kelly Cox and Jessica Kane, solving mysteries that had been cold for nearly 20 years. But through all those hours of interviews, through all the confessions where he detailed exactly how he took those lives, he never mentioned April Lacy. He insisted that his killing spree didn't begin until April 1997, when he took the life of 12-year-old Laura Smither. The question that keeps detectives awake is, why? Why would a man confess to 4 murders, knowing he would spend the rest of his life in a cell, but keep quiet about a 5th? Is it because he truly didn't do it? Or is it because April's case was different? Police have long suspected that April was being exploited and prostituted by her own mother before she disappeared. If April was picked up in a situation involving the sex trade, the killer might have felt even more invisible, thinking that a girl like her wouldn't even be reported missing. There is a specific kind of evil that thrives in the gaps of our society. Predators like Williams and Reese didn't just look for victims. They looked for people they thought the world had already forgotten. They looked for the girls who lived in motels, the girls who scavenged for cans, the girls who had no one to file a police report for 3 months. Take a look at your surroundings right now. What's the weather like today? Is it a gray, heavy afternoon that makes these stories feel even more somber? Let us know in the comments. We read every one, and it helps us build this community of people who refuse to look away. The investigation into the Brush Girl remains officially open. While Reese sits in an Oklahoma prison awaiting his final sentence, and Williams remains behind bars for his own atrocities, April's mother and father have both passed away. They took whatever secrets they had to the grave. But the bones of that 14-year-old girl are still calling for an answer. The story of the predators on the I-35 is a story of how easy it was to be a monster in the 90s. But as we move into the final part of our story, we'll see how the laws are finally catching up with the men who thought the road would protect them forever. We will look at a 2025 ruling that is changing everything for cold cases across the state. The wheels of the American legal system often turn with a slow, agonizing grind that can feel like an insult to the families waiting for answers. For decades, the files on April Lacy sat in a quiet room, gathering the kind of dust that only time can provide. But the mid-20s brought a tectonic shift in how Oklahoma and Texas handle the monsters who stalk the interstates. We are currently living through the fallout of a legal decision that has redefined the boundaries of evidence and opened a new door for cold cases that were once thought to be dead and buried. On July 10, 2025, a date that will likely be cited in law school textbooks for years to come, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals issued a unanimous and heavy ruling. This wasn't just another step in a long process. It was a precedential decision that fundamentally changed the rules of the game for serial predators. The court was looking at the appeal of William Lewis Reese, the man who has spent nearly 30 years dancing around the edges of some of the most horrific crimes in the region. The core of the 2025 ruling focused on something called sexual propensity evidence. In the past, defense lawyers were very successful at keeping a predator's history out of a murder trial, would argue that a jury shouldn't hear about old rapes or previous attacks, because it would prejudice them. It would make them think the person is a monster just because of their past, rather than the specific evidence of the new case. Because of this, many killers were able to stand in front of a jury and look like ordinary men, while their dark history was locked away in a sealed file. The Oklahoma judges decided that the old way of doing things was no longer sufficient for the level of evil they were seeing. They established that if a murder has a clear sexual component or motive, a defendant's history of sexual violence is now admissible in court. They argued that these previous acts are inextricably intertwined with the nature of the crime. Judge David Lewis wrote a majority opinion that cut through the legal jargon with a sharp edge. He stated that the propensity evidence was relevant because it showed the defendant killed his victims in an effort to derive sexual pleasure or gratification. He went as far as to say that this violence was simply the nature of the man. This shift is a massive win for victims like April. In the 90s, the lack of DNA or a direct witness meant these predators could stay silent and let the clock run out. Now the state can show a jury a pattern of behavior that stretches back decades. They can prove that a man didn't just stumble into a crime, he was fulfilling a dark, repetitive compulsion. While this legal battle was reaching its peak, the physical journey of William Reese was coming to a final somber destination. On January 12, 2026, Reese was officially returned to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. He had been in Texas serving multiple life sentences for the murders of Laura Smither, Kelly Cox, and Jessica Kane. But Oklahoma wanted him back to face the ultimate price for the killing of Tiffany Johnston. As of right now, in early 2026, Reese is sitting in a cell on death row, awaiting the execution of a sentence that has been 30 years in the making. Even as Reese faces his end, the case of April Lacy remains a haunting outlier. During his confessions in 2016, Reese gave up the locations of bodies and admitted to crimes that had broken the hearts of families across 2 states. Still, he has never uttered the name of the 14-year-old girl found in the brush in Decatur. Why does a man who knows he is going to die continue to keep one specific secret? Some investigators believe it's because he truly didn't do it and that there is another predator, perhaps someone like the big rig killer John Robert Williams, who carried April across that state line. Others think Reese is simply playing one last game, holding on to the one piece of information that the world still wants from him. There is a symbolic tragedy to this case that transcends the courtroom. As we speak in 2026, nearly 30 years after she was discovered by that farmer, April's grave in Texas reportedly still has no headstone. She was identified. Her name was put back on her records, but the final act of dignity, a stone that tells the world who she was and that she was loved, is still missing. It is as if the universe is waiting for the final piece of the puzzle, the name of her killer, before it allows her to truly rest. The Wise County Sheriff's Office has never moved April's file to the closed cabinet. They are still out there, looking for that one piece of DNA that survived the Texas sun, or that one witness who was finally ready to talk now that the main suspects are either dead or behind bars. The ruling of July 2025 has given them a new weapon. If they can find a match, the legal path to a conviction is now much smoother than it was when April first vanished. Before we conclude this deep dive into the evolution of justice, I want to take a moment for another community check. I'm curious about the world outside your window right now. What's the weather like today? Is it a grey, heavy afternoon for a mystery, or is the sun out where you are? Tell us in the comments. It's a simple way to remind ourselves that life goes on even as we look back at the lives that were cut short. The story of the Brush Girl is a story of a system that failed a child in life but has refused to stop looking for her in death. It is a story of forensic artists like Karen Taylor and detectives like Phil Ryan who spent their careers refusing to let a 14-year-old girl stay anonymous. And now, with the new legal precedents of 2026, we are closer than ever to a world where these predators have nowhere left to hide. 3 decades have passed since the dust settled in that Wise County pasture. Yet some things remain frozen in time. If you were to visit the cemetery where the girl once known as the Brush Girl is buried today, you would find a sight that is as heartbreaking as the day she was found. Despite her name being restored, despite the thousands of people who now know her story, April Dawn Lacy's grave still bears no headstone. It is a bare, flat patch of earth that serves as a final silent witness to the way she lived, overlooked, undervalued, and ultimately left behind by almost every system meant to protect her. April's story is not just a true crime mystery. It is a profound tragedy about what happens when a child becomes invisible. She was a 14-year-old girl who was forced to grow up in the shadow of addiction and instability. She didn't have a childhood defined by school projects or summer camps. Instead, her world was one of cheap motels where the walls were thin and the danger was thick. She spent her days scavenging through garbage for aluminum cans, a survival strategy born from the crushing weight of poverty. The failure, in this case, began long before she reached the border of Texas. It began in a motel room where a mother, Jacqueline, allegedly chose her own addiction over the safety of her daughter. It began with a father, Dale, who allowed 3 full months to pass before he officially told the authorities his child was missing. By the time the legal system even realized April was gone, the trail along the I-35 corridor was already cold, and a rancher in Decatur was already looking at a pile of cedar branches and scrap lumber that held a terrible secret. When we look back at the 90s, we see a world where state lines were walls and information moved far too slow. And the 7, because investigators first thought the victim was a grown woman. The missing person reports for a 14-year-old girl from Oklahoma City never landed on the right desk. April was lost in a forensic gap that allowed her killer to simply keep driving. Whether it was the big rig killer John Robert Williams or the serial predator William Lewis Reese, the outcome was the same. Her young life was snuffed out and discarded like refuse. As of January 24, 2026, the search for the person who strangled April is still active, though the clock is an enemy that never stops. We are living in a new era of justice. The ruling from July 10, 2025 has given prosecutors a new tool by allowing sexual propensity evidence to be heard in court. This means that the predators who thought they could hide behind their past are finally facing the full weight of their actions. William Reese is currently sitting in an Oklahoma prison, awaiting his final sentence after being returned to the state on January 12, 2026. Still, even as he faces the end, he has never confessed to the murder of the girl in the brush. This case reminds us that there are still children out there today who are living in that same motel culture. There are children who are biting their fingernails down to the quick because they don't know who is going to walk through the door next. April Lacy was a child who was desperate for stability, a child who fought for love in a family that was lost to alcohol and drugs. Her death was not an accident. It was a symptom of a society that sometimes looks the other way when the most vulnerable members are in pain. We cannot change the past for April. We cannot go back to that motel room on October 3, 1996, and stop her from walking out the door. But we can refuse to let her story end in silence. We can be the advocate she never had. The persistence of Officer Phil Ryan and the artistry of Karen Taylor proved that no one is truly forgotten, as long as someone is willing to keep looking. They gave her back her name. Now it is up to us to help give her back her justice. If you have any information about the murder of April Dawn Lacy, no matter how small you think it might be, please pick up the phone. A memory from a gas station, a face you saw at a truck stop, or a name you heard whispered in the 90s could be the final piece of this puzzle. You can reach the Wise County Sheriff's Office at 940-627-5971. Your call could be the reason a headstone finally marks that grave in Texas. Before we sign off, I want to say thank you for being part of this community. We are more than just a channel. We are a group of people who believe that every life matters and every victim deserves a voice. What's the weather like today where you are? Drop a comment below and let us know. It's a simple way to stay connected while we navigate these dark histories together. If April's story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Cases Files. Share this video on your social media. The more people who see her face and hear her name, the harder it is for her killer to remain in the shadows. We won't stop until the girl in the brush finally has the peace she was denied 30 years ago. Don't forget to comment "Justice for April" below. We will see you in the next one.